Odette spent 45 years living a life that was not truly hers, inside a carefully arranged marriage that hid a betrayal deeper and older than she had ever suspected. But on a gray Tuesday afternoon, she finally said enough. She signed the papers, left her wedding band on the kitchen counter beside his unopened mail, and drove 9 hours with only $8 in her wallet to the one piece of earth her husband had never managed to take from her, her grandfather's abandoned farm in the Kentucky hills. She expected to find only collapse and the ruins of a childhood she had stopped visiting decades ago. But what Odette discovered beneath the floor of that forgotten farmhouse proved that her grandfather Ansel had been a step ahead of every liar who ever underestimated him, and that the man she had just divorced had spent years trying to steal something worth far more than her freedom. You will not believe what Odette found when she pulled up the loose stone in that old root cellar. If you believe that starting over is the best kind of justice, hit that subscribe button right now and join our community. Every week on this channel, we tell the stories of women who prove that the best chapters of life are never the ones you planned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The study had always been his room. That was one of the unspoken arrangements of their marriage, and like many of the arrangements Odette had accepted, she could not remember when exactly she had agreed to it, only that she had. The rest of the house was shared. The kitchen where she had cooked 45 years of suppers. The dining room where they had raised their daughter, Imogen. The bedroom where she had slept beside a man she believed she knew, night after night, for more than 4 decades. But the study was his. She knocked before entering, though he had never asked her to. She did not open the drawers of his desk. She did not touch the locked credenza in the corner. She had observed these boundaries for so long that she had stopped noticing they existed, the way a person stops noticing the weight of a ring on their finger until the morning they finally take it off. On the Tuesday morning that everything began to unravel, she went into the study because she thought she smelled something burning somewhere in the house, and she was checking each room the way a careful woman checks things. The smell turned out to be nothing more than a candle she had left burning too long in the hallway. But on her way back through the study, her elbow clipped the corner of a thin manila folder that had been resting at the very edge of his desk, a folder she had never noticed before, set in a place where it had no reason to be, and the folder slipped and its contents fanned out across the rug. She stood very still and looked at what had fallen. Account statements. She recognized the shape of them immediately. She had managed their household finances for 45 years, and she knew what a bank statement looked like. But these were not from any account she had ever seen. The account number was foreign. The balance was substantial, and the transaction history, which she read with the quiet focus of a woman who understands numbers, told a story that took her less than 4 minutes to decipher. Monthly wire transfers to a consulting firm in Louisville. She did not recognize the firm. Monthly payments to a private storage facility outside Frankfort, Kentucky. She did not recognize that address either. Payments to a title company. Payments to a surveying outfit. Payments to a legal office in Lexington. And the dates. The dates stretched back, consistent and unbroken, across a span she checked twice because she did not trust her first reading. 11 years. For 11 years, Gideon had been funneling money towards something in Kentucky, in the very county where her grandfather's farm sat empty and forgotten. Her hands did not shake. She noted this with the detached curiosity of someone watching herself from just outside her own skin. Her hands were not shaking because something had happened that was too large for trembling, something that required her to go still and begin the quiet interior work of reorganizing everything she had believed to be true. She gathered the pages carefully, one by one, in the order they had fallen. She smoothed each one. She slipped them back into the folder and placed the folder at the exact angle she remembered it occupying before her elbow had disturbed it. She was meticulous. She needed Gideon not to know, not yet, that she knew. She needed time, and time required that the room show no evidence of disturbance. Then she walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink with both hands flat on the counter, looking out the window at the dogwood tree she had planted the year Imogen was born, and she began, very quietly, to understand that the life she had been living was not the life she had thought she was living at all. She thought about Kentucky. She thought about her grandfather's farm on the ridge above Bramble Creek, the 180 acres that had been the Brennan family since before the Civil War, the farmhouse she had not set foot in since her grandfather Ansel's funeral 32 years ago. She thought about Gideon's peculiar patience over the decades whenever the subject of that farm arose, the way he had always gently steered her away from visiting, the way he had suggested more than once, with the soft reasonableness of a man offering her a favor, that the property was too remote and too ruined to be worth the drive. She had accepted these suggestions the way she had accepted so many of his suggestions, without examining them too closely, because she had trusted him. She thought about her grandfather Ansel. Ansel Brennan had been a man of few words and enormous internal precision. He had raised her every summer of her childhood on that farm after her own parents died in the accident when she was 7. He had taught her to read the weather by the movement of the grass in the lower field, to recognize the difference between a healthy barrel of mash and one that had turned, to tell a dishonest man by the way he looked at a handshake instead of the face. He had never said a single critical word about Gideon when she had announced their engagement. But he had done something else, something she had not understood at the time, and that now, standing at the kitchen sink, arranged itself in her mind with sudden, clean meaning. For months before he died, Ansel had changed his will, quietly, through his own attorney in Bramble Creek, without discussion. He had left the farm and every structure on it not to Odette and Gideon jointly, as his previous will had specified, but to Odette alone, her name only. She had assumed at the time that it was the kind of tidying up an aging man does when he is putting his affairs in order. She had not thought about it since. She thought about it now. She went upstairs to the small desk in the spare bedroom where she kept the household documents, and she pulled out the folder containing her grandfather's will. She read it twice. Odette Marie Brennan Vreeland, sole beneficiary of the Brennan property, Lot 14, Bramble Creek Township, Bourbon County, Kentucky. No joint ownership, no shared interest. Her grandfather had known something. He had not been able to name it directly. That was not the kind of man he was, but he had done something about it. He had moved the one thing he could move into a place where Gideon could not reach it. She placed the will back in the folder. She washed her face with cold water. She looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror for a long, unsentimental moment, and then she went to find her address book. She called an attorney named Margot Esperanza, a woman who had handled a small neighborhood dispute on Odette's behalf 12 years ago, whose business card Odette had kept for reasons she could not have named at the time, but was grateful for now. She left a message requesting an appointment as soon as Margot could fit her in. Then she went about the rest of her day with the methodical calm of a woman who has identified what needs to be done and is preparing to do it properly. Gideon came home at 6:15, as he always did. She served dinner, as she always did. They spoke about the small, ordinary things that 45 years of shared life produced to fill the silences, and she watched him across the table and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was seeing him without any filter at all. She slept beside him that night, without mentioning the folder, because she did not yet have enough to move. She had spent 45 years inside a life he had carefully arranged around what he needed her not to know. She could wait a few more days. Margot Esperanza called back the next morning. The appointment was Thursday. In the 2 days between the phone call and the meeting, Odette did what she had always done when managing a complex situation. She gathered information. She was patient, and she was exact. She photographed every page of the folder while Gideon was at his office. She located the key to the lock credenza on her second attempt, tucked behind a clock on the mantel where he kept things he considered secure because she had never once looked there. She opened the credenza with the steady hands of a woman no longer in possession of a trust worth preserving. She found a second folder, and inside that folder, she found documents relating to her grandfather's property that should not have existed at all. Power of attorney papers bearing her signature, which she had never signed. A letter from a state historical commission addressed to Gideon, discussing the pre-prohibition significance of a structure on the Brennan land. A proposal from a boutique distillery in Lexington offering 6 figures for exclusive access to the property, copied to Gideon at a Louisville post office box she had never known existed. She photographed everything. She put every page back exactly where she had found it. She locked the credenza and returned the key to its place behind the mantel clock. And she waited for Thursday. Margot Esperanza was 58 years old, with the quiet, unhurried manner of an attorney who has listened to hundreds of difficult stories and been surprised by fewer of them than she once expected. She listened to Odette with the stillness of a woman cataloging details in real time. When Odette had finished, Margot was quiet for a full minute before she spoke. "The signature on these power of attorney papers," she said. "You're certain it's not yours?" "I have never signed a single document related to my grandfather's property," Odette said. "He left it to me alone. No one has ever discussed selling it or leasing it or licensing it, because no one has ever discussed it with me at all." Margot nodded slowly. "I want you to understand what you're describing," she said. "Forged power of attorney documents, combined with the concealed accounts and 11 years of directed financial activity toward a property you legally own. This is fraud. Civil and likely criminal. It's a significant matter. I understand. This process will take time. Divorce proceedings, a fraud investigation, property protections. None of it happens overnight. I have been patient for 45 years, Odette said. I can be patient a little longer." She filed for divorce the following Monday. She did not warn Gideon. She did not offer him the courtesy of preparation or the chance to soften the arrival of what was already on its way. She had extended every courtesy to that man for 45 years, and he had quietly turned each one into a tool. She was finished extending courtesies. The papers were served at his office on a Wednesday morning, a timing she chose deliberately. She did not wish to see his face when he received them. She wanted to be elsewhere, doing something useful, while the papers arrived in his hands. She was in the kitchen, packing. She packed with the economy of a woman who has thought carefully about what actually matters. 2 weeks of clothing. The shoebox of photographs from the top of the hall closet. Her parents before the accident. Ansel in his coveralls standing in front of the old barn. Imogen at every age. Her mother's silver thimble. Her personal documents. Her grandfather's will. The copies of every photograph she had taken of Gideon's folders, loaded onto a small drive she placed at the bottom of her purse. She left the rest. The furniture they had chosen together. The china she had cooked 45 years of meals around. The drapes she had hung in 1986 and never once replaced because she had liked them. She left all of it the way you leave things that belong to a version of your life that is over. She discovered at the bank that morning that Gideon had already moved to freeze their joint accounts. Margot had warned her this was likely. Odette had $8 in her wallet and a tank of gas, and the credit card in her own name that she had quietly opened 6 years earlier and never used. She took the $8, the gas, and the card, and she pointed the car west and south, toward Kentucky, toward the ridge above Bramble Creek. She had not been back in 32 years. She had told herself across those years that the distance was too great, the drive too long, the farm too ruined to be worth the effort. She understood now that she had been guided away from it, patiently and consistently, by a man who had known what it was worth and had needed her not to know. The reasons had been managed. Her absence had been useful. The drive took 9 hours. She stopped once for gas and once for a bag of peanuts from a vending machine at a rest stop in West Virginia, which she counted out in quarters from the cup holder. She slept 2 hours in a truck stop parking lot outside Huntington with her coat pulled over her. She did not cry. She simply drove. The Appalachians opened up around her in the late afternoon, and then the rolling bluegrass of central Kentucky, and then the smaller county roads that she had not driven in 3 decades, but that came back to her with the reliability of things learned in childhood. The oak at the bend by Tucker's old pasture. The limestone outcropping. The mailbox shaped like a barn that had belonged to her grandfather's nearest neighbor and was still there, faded but upright. She turned onto the gravel track and parked where her grandfather had always parked, beneath the sycamore at the edge of the yard, and she sat in the car for a long while looking at what the years had done. The farmhouse was standing. She had half feared it would not be, had imagined every possible ruin across the long drive. But it stood. The porch sagged on the right. The roof needed work. The garden had been reclaimed by honeysuckle and tall grass. But the bones were good. Her grandfather had built to last, and it had lasted. She got out of the car and took the key from the bottom of her purse, the key she had been carrying for 32 years and had never used, and she climbed the porch steps and put in the lock. The lock resisted. 32 years of disuse had made it stubborn, and she worked the key slowly, feeling for the give, not forcing it, the way Ansel had always worked things. After a moment, the mechanism turned, and the door swung inward on hinges that groaned but held. The smell of the house came out to meet her, the particular smell of a closed space that has been standing undisturbed for a very long time. Cedar and old paper, and something faintly sweet that she recognized before she could name it. The smell of her grandfather's kitchen in the early mornings of her childhood. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she stepped inside. The house was smaller than she remembered. That was always true of childhood, places revisited in adult life. The scale of memory was the scale of a child, and the reality was always a modest correction, not a diminishment, but an accuracy. A Kentucky farmhouse built in 1911, functional and well-made, with the solidity of a structure built by people who intended to live in it for generations. Her grandfather's furniture was still in place under the dust of 3 decades. The pine table where she had eaten every breakfast of every summer. The rocking chair by the window. The cast-iron stove that had fed 4 generations of Brennans. The dust lay evenly across everything. Not the dust of neglect, but of patient waiting, as if the house had simply been holding its breath. She moved through each room slowly, noting what was sound and what needed attention. The kitchen was in the best condition. Her grandfather had kept it in working order through the years he had lived there alone. The pipes had held. The wood stove was intact. The window above the sink still gave the same view of the back field and the ridgeline beyond, the view she had looked at every morning of her childhood. She set her purse on the pine table and stood at that window for a while. She thought about Ansel standing at this window. He had been a morning man, always awake before anyone else, always with the coffee already made by the time she came downstairs in her nightgown. She had taken this for granted as a child. She understood now that what she had taken for granted had been a form of love, the quiet, unannounced kind that does not call attention to itself, but simply continues, morning after morning, until the person who provided it is gone and you feel the exact shape of what has been removed. She made up the bed in her old room with the sheets she had brought. She went to sleep early, and she slept better than she had slept in years, in the particular way of someone who has returned to a place that knows her. In the morning, she began. She worked the way Ansel had always worked, one thing at a time, in order of priority, without rushing. She opened every window. She swept, then mopped, then swept again. She made lists of what needed repair and what could wait. She drove the 9 miles into Bramble Creek with her last $5 and a plan to put the hardware store purchases on her credit card. She introduced herself at the counter to a tall woman with steel gray hair and a Scandinavian accent, who turned out to be Greta Lindqvist, the owner, who listened to Odette's brief explanation and said only, "Brennan's granddaughter. I remember your grandfather," and wrote down the name of a handyman named Abner Sandoval, who, Greta said, did honest work and did not overcharge widows or women starting over. Abner came the next day. He walked the property with her and spoke plainly. The porch needed re-leveling. The roof had 3 sections that wanted new shake. The gutters needed clearing. The furnace would need servicing before the Kentucky winter arrived. The garden was a longer project, and she set it aside for now and focused on the structure of the house. She called Imogen on the 4th day. Imogen was 42 and lived in Nashville with her partner Desmond, and she had been calling since Monday with increasing worry. Odette had not picked up until now because she had needed these 4 days to be entirely herself, without the weight of anyone else's response. "Mom," Imogen said, "are you all right?" "I'm better than I've been in a long time," Odette said. And she meant it. She told Imogen everything. The folder on the desk, the concealed accounts, the forged power of attorney, the Louisville post office box, the 9-hour drive with $8. She told her calmly and completely, the way she would have told her anything, and she could hear in the quality of Imogen's silence the particular sound of someone absorbing information that reorganized the architecture of what they had thought they understood. "I'm coming this weekend," Imogen said. "I know you are," Odette said. "I'll have a guest room ready." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Imogen arrived that Friday afternoon with Desmond and 2 coolers of groceries and the particular energy of a daughter who has decided she is going to be useful. They worked together through the weekend. Desmond was a quiet man with capable hands and the kind of patience that does not announce itself. He helped Abner patch the worst of a roof, while Imogen and Odette scrubbed the kitchen walls back to the original pine beneath 4 decades of yellowed paint. They ate sandwiches on the back porch in the cool October light, and Imogen asked her mother questions she had not known how to ask on the telephone, and Odette answered them without hurry, because the weight of the last 45 years was finally a thing she could set down piece by piece onto a table between them and examine in the open. On Sunday afternoon, Imogen and Desmond drove back to Nashville. Imogen hugged her mother on the porch for longer than either of them had hugged in years. "I'll be back in 2 weeks," she said. And then Odette was alone again in the house, which was beginning to feel, for the first time, like a place rather than a ruin. She turned to the root cellar on Tuesday. The root cellar opened off the back of the kitchen, down 6 stone steps, into a low-ceilinged room built into the slope of the hill. It was the oldest part of the house, older than the farmhouse itself, and her grandfather had used it to store preserves and seed potatoes and the occasional cured ham. She had not been down those steps since she was a girl. She expected to find a damp, half-collapsed space, useful for nothing. What she found was a dry, cool room with stone walls that had held for over a century, a dirt floor packed hard by generations of boots, and along the back wall an old wooden shelving unit that had buckled inward at an odd angle, as if something behind it had pushed it forward from the wall. She stood looking at it for a long moment. She had not been looking for anything. That was the detail she would return to later whenever she told this part of the story. She had simply been assessing. But she noticed the angle of the shelving, and she noticed that the stones in the wall directly behind it were a slightly different color than the stones elsewhere in the cellar, a fraction paler, with mortar lines that were newer, applied at a different time from the rest. She ran her fingers along the seam, and the seam moved. A section of what had appeared to be wall shifted inward under the light pressure of her hand. She went very still. Then she went upstairs to the pantry and found Ansel's toolbox, still in the same place it had occupied her entire childhood, and she brought down a crowbar and a flashlight. She worked the stones out slowly, one by one, the way he had always worked things, without forcing. After the 4th stone came free, she could see that what lay behind the wall was not more wall. It was a doorway, a narrow, reinforced doorway, mortared shut with deliberate care, concealed behind a false panel of stones that had been set to match the surrounding cellar. She cleared enough of the opening to step through, and she pointed the flashlight ahead of her, and she stepped inside. A staircase descended. Stone steps, narrow and even, spiraling down into the hillside behind the root cellar. She counted them as she went. 22. At the bottom of the 22nd step, the flashlight beam struck wood. Rows of wood, curved, banded with iron. Barrels. She stood at the foot of the staircase and moved the flashlight slowly across what lay before her. A long, low-ceilinged chamber, carved into the limestone of the ridge itself, the walls dry and cool and perfectly regulated by the natural temperature of the earth. And in that chamber, stacked 3 high along wooden racks her grandfather had built by hand, were barrels. She counted the first row, 18. She moved the light to the second row, and the third, and the fourth, and she stopped counting. There were hundreds. On a small wooden table at the center of the chamber sat a lantern, a ledger book, and a sealed envelope. Her name was written across the front of the envelope in her grandfather's handwriting, the careful block letters she had known her entire life. Odette Marie, not her married name, just the name he had given her. She carried the lantern and the ledger and the envelope up the 22 steps and out through the cellar and into the kitchen, and she set them on the pine table where she had eaten every breakfast of every summer of her childhood, and she sat down in her grandfather's chair, and opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages long, written in his steady, unhurried hand. She read it once without stopping. Then she went to the stove and made a pot of coffee the way he had made it, with chicory stirred in at the end, and she sat back down and read the letter again, this time slowly, and when she had finished, she sat for a long time looking at the light on the kitchen floor and thinking about her grandfather. Then she picked up her phone and called Margot Esperanza. "I need an appointment," she said. "Tomorrow, if you can. I found something." Margot Esperanza, when she saw the letter and the ledger, was quiet for longer than she had been during their first meeting. She read the pages twice, slowly, with the careful attention of a woman for whom documents were a primary language. And when she set the last page down, she looked at Odette with an expression that was not quite surprise, but something rarer in a practicing attorney, a recognition of the full weight of what was in front of them. "Your grandfather built a private aging facility beneath the farmhouse," Margot said. "He laid down barrels from 1962 until 6 months before he died in 1994. 32 years of continuous production, never sold, never commercialized, never registered under his name publicly, but legally distilled under a small batch craft license that he renewed every year, that he transferred into a family trust naming you as sole beneficiary 8 months before his death. Yes, the trust has been active and in good standing for the entire period. The license has been maintained by a trustee at the Bramble Creek Bank, who has been paying the annual fees out of fund your grandfather established for that purpose. The bourbon has been aging legally under an active license in a facility that belongs entirely to you for 32 years. Yes, your ex-husband has been trying for 11 years to locate this facility and acquire it through fraudulent instruments because he understood from the historical commission letter and from whatever else he was able to piece together that it existed and that it would be valuable. But he never found it because your grandfather built the entrance behind a false wall, and because you, being the only living person who knew the root cellar at all, had been kept away from this land for your entire marriage. Margot set the ledger down and folded her hands on top of it. "Odette," she said, "I need you to understand what you have. I'm not a whiskey expert, but I know enough to tell you that a continuous, legally aged, family-owned bourbon stock spanning 6 decades, with documented provenance and an intact recipe ledger, is not a normal discovery. This is a once-in-a-generation find. Before we do anything else, we need to bring in someone who can tell us exactly what is down there." The someone was Corbin Wexley, a master distiller in his late 60s who had spent 40 years in the Kentucky bourbon industry and who drove up from Louisville 3 days later with a small leather case, and the particular reverence of a man being told he is about to see something he has only read about. He spent an entire afternoon in the chamber beneath the house. When he came back up the 22 steps and stood in Odette's kitchen, his hands were not quite steady. "Ma'am," he said, "I have evaluated bourbon collections for 30 years. I have never seen what I just saw down there." He sat at the pine table. "The earliest barrels are 1962. The latest are 1994. Your grandfather was running a single-barrel operation using a pre-prohibition family recipe that I do not recognize, which means it predates the publicly registered recipes of every major distillery currently operating. The wood is white oak from the property, for what I can tell, harvested by your grandfather himself. The aging conditions are as close to perfect as I have ever seen, and there are 847 barrels." He paused. "The oldest of them have been aging for 62 years. I am not being dramatic when I tell you that a single bottle from one of those barrels, properly cased and authenticated, could command 6 figures at auction, and you have 847 of them." Odette listened without speaking. She had already known, in some way, from the moment she had read her grandfather's letter. But hearing it said aloud by a man who was himself stunned by it gave the knowledge a shape she could hold. She thought about her grandfather's letter. "I know my Odette. She will come when she is ready, and she will know what to do with what I left her." She knew. She did not sell. Margot had been clear about the options, and Odette had been clearer about her answer. She negotiated, with Margot's guidance and Corbin's expertise, a licensing and stewardship partnership with a small heritage distillery in Lexington, whose principles she respected and whose terms she controlled. The bourbon would be released in small annual allotments over the next 20 years. The recipe would remain her property. The facility would remain her facility. The Brenna name would be on every bottle. The first royalty payment arrived on a Thursday morning in March, 5 months after she had found the chamber, and she looked at the figure on the statement and sat with it quietly for a moment, and then she called Imogen. "I think your great-grandfather knew exactly what he was doing," she said. "He always did," Imogen said. The farmhouse by spring was restored. The porch re-leveled. The roof re-shingled. The interior repainted. The garden cleared. The dogwood she had planted in her grandmother's memory set against the south wall. Her days moved to a rhythm entirely her own, and every morning she drank her coffee at the pine table and looked out at the ridge her grandfather had farmed. And she understood, finally, the precise shape of the love he had left her. He arrived on a Saturday morning in late October, 8 months after she had left. She saw the car from the kitchen window. A rental, she noticed, which told her something about the state of things. Gideon had always driven his own car. A particular model he replaced every 3 years with a consistency she had once found dependable and now recognized as a performance of stability rather than evidence of it. A rental car meant things had changed significantly in his life. She watched him step out of the driver's side and stand in the yard, looking at the house. She could see, even from the kitchen window, that he was processing what he saw. The restored porch, the new roof, the repainted exterior, the garden that was, in its late October condition, more ordered and more alive than it had been in 40 years. He had last seen this property in documents and photographs and historical commission letters. He had never seen it as she had made it. She set down her coffee cup. She walked to the front door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch before he reached the steps. "Odette," he said. He looked diminished. That was the word that came to her, without satisfaction, simply as an observation. The particular quality he had always carried, the ease of a man who believed the world arranged itself for his convenience, was gone from him. What remained was someone who had arrived at a difficult conversation and did not know how to begin. "I wonder when you would come," she said. She did not invite him up. She stood on the porch she had restored and looked at him in the cool October light. He talked for a while. She let him talk because she had always been a good listener and because she wanted to hear the shape of what he had come to say. He talked about the investigation, about the pressure he was under, about his financial situation, about the mistakes he had made. He used that word, mistakes, and she noted it without commenting. Eventually he arrived at the reason he had come, which was that he needed help. He wanted her to intervene in the fraud proceedings. He wanted access to the bourbon facility, which his attorneys, he said, believed might be considered marital property since it had been discovered during the marriage. He wanted, in short, the mercy of a woman who had every reason to withhold it. She let him finish. Then she went inside without a word. He did not follow. She had not invited him. She came back with a folder and held it out to him across the porch rail. "This is everything," she said. "Everything your attorney already has, and everything Margot Esperanza has prepared. I want you to understand clearly what the record shows." He took the folder. He opened it. She watched him read the first page, which was the summary document Margot had assembled. The forged power of attorney, the 11 years of concealed accounts, the Louisville post office box, the surveying firm, the title company, the letter from the Historical Commission, the Lexington Distillery offer. She watched him reach the section of the summary that dealt with the bourbon facility itself, and she watched his face register that his attorneys had given him a theory, not a fact. "The facility was placed in a trust 8 months before my grandfather died," she said, without raising her voice. "The trust names me as sole beneficiary. The license has been maintained in my name, through the trust, for 32 years. The barrels were laid down across 32 years, most of them long before I met you. Nothing about it is marital property. Margot has the documentation. Your attorneys will tell you the same thing once they have read it properly." He looked up from the folder. "I want you to understand," she said, "that I am not doing this to hurt you. I am doing this because it is accurate and because you should know what accuracy looks like. You spent 45 years deciding what I needed to know. This is what I have decided you need to know." He was quiet. "The proceedings will continue," she said. That is not something I'm going to change. What you did is what the record shows, and the record will stand." She paused. "I spent 45 years taking care of things that were not my responsibility because I believed it was what a good partner did. I am done doing that. What happens next is your responsibility, as it should have been all along." She held out her hand for the folder. He gave it back. "I think you should go," she said. Not unkindly, simply clearly. He stood for a moment on the bottom step of the porch she had restored, looking up at her. She did not look away. She did not soften. She had said what needed to be said, and it was complete. He got back in the rental car and sat for a long moment before he started the engine. Then he drove down the gravel track and turned onto the county road and was gone. And the quiet of the property settled back into place around her. November came to Bourbon County with the particular clarity of Kentucky autumns. Cold mornings and warm afternoons, and a quality of light on the limestone ridges that made the landscape look like something out of an old tobacco barn painting you might see in a county museum and think must have been an idealization, until you lived in the valley and understood that the painter had simply been accurate. Odette had always loved November. She had forgotten this, or had let it recede behind the more pressing textures of her previous life. And the rediscovery of it was one of the small, steady pleasures of the year she was having, the accumulation of things she had once known and set aside and was finding again. She worked in the garden in the mornings and read in the afternoons and cooked simple meals she ate at the pine table, looking out at the back field. She had been, in her previous life, a person who ate with purpose and efficiency and attention directed elsewhere. Now she ate with the simple pleasure of someone tasting things properly for the first time, unhurried, without the background work of managing another person's expectations shaping the meal. She had been, in her previous life, a reader who never quite had enough time to read. She understood now that the lack of time had been, in some measure, managed. She was reading properly now, novels she had been meaning to finish for 20 years, and they were exactly as good as she had hoped. She drove into Bramble Creek twice a week for groceries and errands, and she had developed, over the months, the kind of acquaintances with the people there that grow from regular presence and genuine interest. Greta at the hardware store, who set aside the catalogs Odette liked. Abner, who had become something more than a handyman and something less than a brother, a steady presence at the edge of her days. Tucker Ballinger, the farmer from the neighboring property, who had brought her a basket of apples in September and had stayed for coffee, and who had become, over the weeks that followed, something she might eventually call a friend. She had been lonely in her marriage in a way she had not named while she was inside it. She was not lonely now. There was a particular afternoon in mid-November that she would remember later as the moment she understood, with full and settled clarity, that the life she was now living was in fact her life, and not a temporary arrangement she was inhabiting until something else resumed. She had been out in the garden clearing the last of the tomato plants, and the light had shifted in that specific late autumn way, and she had stood up to stretch her back and looked at the house, and the house had looked back at her. That was the only way she could describe it later when Imogen asked what had changed. The house had looked back at her, and she had understood, in the way you understand a thing that has been true for a long time, but has only just become visible, that she was home. Not visiting, not rebuilding. Home. She took on a project that week that she had been turning over in her mind for some time. In the attic of the farmhouse, in a cedar trunk that had belonged to her grandmother, she had found, during the summer restoration, a collection of recipe cards written in her grandmother Willa May's careful schoolteacher's hand. Dozens of them. Preserves and pickles and breads, and the particular chess pie her grandmother had made every Christmas Eve. Odette had set the cards aside in the summer because she had not yet had time to sit with them properly. In November, when the outdoor work eased, she brought them down to the kitchen and spread them across the pine table. She read them one by one, slowly, and where her grandmother's handwriting had faded, she copied the recipes onto fresh cards in her own hand, and where her grandmother had made notes in the margins. Use the early pears, not the later, or add vinegar only at the end, or it will turn. She copied the notes too, because the notes were the actual inheritance. The accumulated knowledge of a woman who had cooked for a family through 2 wars and the Great Depression and 71 Kentucky summers. She worked on the cards for 2 weeks. When she finished, she had a box of rewritten recipes that she could pass to Imogen when the time came, and a deeper understanding of her grandmother than she had carried through her entire adult life. Imogen came for Thanksgiving with Desmond. They cooked together in the kitchen Ansel had used, at the stove that worked exactly as it should after Abner's servicing, and they ate at the table where 4 generations of Brennans had eaten. Odette made her grandmother's chess pie from the recipe card, and Imogen ate 2 slices and Desmond ate 3, and they sat afterward in the soft, exhausted quiet of a good meal ending well. After dinner, when Desmond had gone to sit by the fire with his book, Imogen sat across from her mother with a mug of tea. "You look different," she said. "From a year ago." "I'm different. Better. Yes." Odette thought carefully about how to say the next part. "I think I was always this person," she said. "I just was not in the right conditions to be her." Imogen looked at her for a long moment. "Grandpa Ansel spent his whole life," she said, "making sure that when you were ready, you would have what you needed. I think that's what love actually looks like," Odette said. "Not the loud version. The version that does the work quietly and trusts that the right person will know what to do with it." Imogen was quiet for a while. "Mom," she said eventually, "can I ask you something I've been wondering about?" "Of course. Do you ever regret the 45 years?" Odette had expected this question at some point from someone, perhaps from Imogen herself. She had thought about it across the months. She had a real answer, not a manufactured one. "I regret not seeing him clearly sooner," she said. "I regret the years I spent managing a life I did not realize was being managed back at me. But I do not regret what those years made me, because what those years made me is the woman who walked into that study on a Tuesday morning and knew, within 4 minutes, exactly what she was looking at. The patience, the precision, the way I handled it." She paused. "Your great-grandfather used to tell me that anything worth building takes longer than you expect and is harder than you want." He was talking about a barn, but he was also talking about a person. I think I needed every one of those 45 years to become the person who was finally ready to find what he had left me. Imogen nodded slowly. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The fraud case concluded in the spring. The outcome was what Margot had indicated it would be. Significant civil penalties. A criminal judgment that would take years to satisfy. Consequences that were proportionate to what the record showed. Odette read Margot's summary and filed it and did not return to it. It was finished, and it was accurate, and she was done attending to it. She heard through Imogen, who heard through mutual acquaintances, that Gideon had moved to a smaller apartment outside Cincinnati and had taken a position at a consulting firm where he was, by all accounts, quieter than he had once been. Odette received this information the way a person receives weather reports about a place they no longer live. She noted it. She did not dwell on it. The first limited edition release of the Brennan Bourbon went to auction in April. Corbin Wexley handled the presentation. 12 bottles, from a single barrel laid down in 1963 by Ansel Brennan on land his father had farmed, bottled under the name her grandmother had gone by before she married, Willa May Reserve. The label, which Odette had designed with a graphic artist in Lexington across 6 careful meetings, featured a simple line drawing of the dogwood tree that still stood beside the south wall of the farmhouse, and beneath it, in small type, the words Bramble Creek, Kentucky, distilled with patience, aged in good ground. She had chosen the phrasing herself. It was the closest she could come to saying what her grandfather had meant without saying it directly. Odette watched the auction from the porch of the farmhouse, with Imogen and Desmond on either side of her. The final hammer price made the news. Corbin called within the hour, his voice carrying the particular register of a man who had just watched history move. She thanked him and set the phone down and went inside to put on the kettle. She made tea for the 3 of them. They drank it on the porch in the April light. Nobody said very much. There was not very much that needed to be said. She established 2 things that spring with Margot's help. The first was a fund in her grandfather's name that would provide scholarships to young people from Bourbon County studying agriculture, distilling, or the restoration of historic farm structures. The second was a stewardship arrangement ensuring that the farm itself would remain in the Brennan family after her, never subdivided, never sold, passed to Imogen with a set of restrictions that would carry forward to Imogen's children if she had them. She was making sure, the way her grandfather had made sure, that the things she had been given would continue to be given. She bought new bulbs for the garden that autumn. She ordered them from a catalog, the way her grandmother had always ordered them, and she planted them in the sections of the garden her grandmother had planted before her. Daffodils along the east fence, tulips beneath the kitchen window, hyacinths beside the porch steps, because her grandmother had always said a porch without spring flowers was a porch that had given up on the year. They came up that April with the reliable persistence of things put in good ground by careful hands. And when she stood on her porch in the mornings with her coffee and watched the light move across the field where her grandfather had once farmed and where her grandfather's grandfather had farmed before him, she understood that the quiet work of love passes forward through people who do not always know that they are carrying it. She was 72 years old, and she was, for the first time in as long as she could precisely remember, entirely herself. Not a version of herself adjusted to someone else's requirements. Not a woman managed down to fit inside someone else's comfort. Simply herself, in the full and specific sense of a person who has found, through the complete loss of what she thought she had, the thing she had actually had all along. Her grandfather had known this about her. He had preserved the conditions for it. And on every morning that she sat at his table with her coffee and looked out at the land that was hers, the land that had always been hers, that had been waiting with the patience of things rooted in good ground, she felt the particular quality of his love, which was not the love that announces itself, but the love that builds something solid and trust that the person it was built for will find her way to it. She had found her way to it. If you have ever discovered that the foundation of your life was not what you believed it to be, if you have ever had to start over with nothing but what you knew yourself to be capable of, if you have ever trusted that the truth, handled with patience and precision, will eventually do what it needs to do, this story belongs to you. Because Odette did not survive her husband's betrayal. She outlasted it. And there is a difference. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that what is taken from you does not define you. That what your mother or your father or your grandfather or your own quiet knowing has preserved for you is waiting. That the land beneath your feet, if it was given to you with love, is solid. We are so grateful you walked this road with us today. We'll see you in the next story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.